Good evening. My role is really, I'm David Wilson, the President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. My role is, first of all, to welcome you, and I do that most warmly. I admire those who have been here for most of the day for their perseverance. And so to them, congratulations, and to the rest of you, simply welcome. I shall hand over in a moment to Richard Keane. My other duties are to say, we assume you're literate, and we assume you've read that, and when there's a fire, you go out to the George Hotel. And with any luck, we then come back later. Second, much more important thing, please, no decent trial can go ahead if there are mobile phones. So if you would very kindly please turn off your mobile phones. With that, I would like to welcome also very warmly Mr. Richard Keane, QC, who is Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, who is going to be, I don't know if judge is the right word, or we can borrow from Parliament, presiding officer, but he is going to preside in a judgely way. So if I might hand over to you.
Thank you, Lord Wilson. When it's suggested that I preside in a judgely way, you have my assurance I'm not going to fall asleep. I think I may have murmured about 7 senators with that one, but we'll move on. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome here for this debate following a day of discussion, some of which I have to admit I missed, but the results of which I've been able to discuss. There are 1 or 2 points I should raise at the outset about the way in which this will proceed. It may or may not be judicial, but as Lord Wilson indicated, it would be helpful if people didn't have mobile phones on. The jug of water is to receive those that do go off. So I just mentioned that. We are going to hear a debate, and you are going to be the jury. And consequently, you will not be invited to make contributions. You will not be invited to ask questions during the course of the debate. We will have 2 teams. First of all, Professor Grayling and Professor Tallis, who will propose the motion or speak in favour of the question, which I'm going to come to in a moment, and then Professor Haldane and Baroness Finley, who will speak in opposition to the motion or the question. The format is fairly flexible. I anticipate that in opening, Professor Grayling will address you, and then invite Professor Tallis to come up and perhaps respond to a series of questions, leading or otherwise. I'm not going to intervene and object to leading questions, that he may then address. And thereafter, Professor Haldane and Baroness Finley will make their own contributions. Now, the question which has been posed should be coming up above my head. Yes, indeed. If it could be demonstrated that it would never be open to abuse, would you support in principle the idea of assisted dying? I did not draft the question. Nevertheless, all our speakers are prepared and ready to address that question. At the outset, you will be asked to vote, and I'm advised that if you wish to vote yes to the question, you should hand in a blue card. Can I say, I have been sorely misled. And I demand a recount. I rather think that we ought to be consistent about this, if only so that we can interpret the results. So you can read this, I can't. Why you would say red for yes, I'm not sure, but it's red for yes, as it says here, and it's no for blue. So in a moment, I will ask you to vote on the question, and those votes will be counted. The result will not be disclosed until the end. Thereafter, we will hear from our speakers, and there is a reference to me summing up I'm not going to poison the well by endeavouring to inflict upon you my summary of the various submissions that you're going to hear. What I may do is ask a question or two of the speakers in order to elucidate, for my benefit at least, some of the points that they make. Thereafter, you will vote again, red for yes, as it says here, and blue for no. And those votes will be collected and counted. While that count is going on, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions of the speakers, because of course at that stage such questions will not influence the outcome of the debate. Now, I should say a little about each of our speakers, but in view of the time it will just be a little. Professor Anthony Grayling, as many of you will know, is Professor of Philosophy at Birkbeck College at the University of London and a Fellow of St Anne's College. He's written and edited many works on philosophy and indeed other subjects. He's a contributor to a number of newspapers. I note that at one time he did write the column for the Guardian newspaper known as The Last Word. I don't know if there's any connection, but there we are. He's a trustee of the London Library, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He will be accompanied by Professor Roman Tallis. Professor Tallis, I think, could best be described as a polymath. He is described as a philosopher, a poet, a novelist, and a cultural critic. But for many years, he was, of course, a professor of medicine at the University of Manchester and remains a visiting professor at St George's Hospital Medical School. He's published widely on philosophy, works of fiction, and on poetry, published his own poetry. And I think at this point I will invite Professor Anthony Grayling to address us. Thank you. Oh, I apologise. I will not. I've managed to get that wrong as well. You will first of all vote by handing in your voting cards, red for yes, blue for no.
Could you pass them to the right-hand side of the road, please?
Professor Grayling.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, as you would imagine, I will support anything whatever that's not open to abuse. So I'm sure that you will take the question with a little tincture of scepticism, but you'll understand where the two sides of the argument are coming from. And I want to begin by saying that in the debate about assisted dying, from the point of view of those who support legalizing assisted dying, the concern is a deeply moral one, and it turns on the central tenet of any responsible and serious moral outlook, which is that our relationship to other people, our attitude towards them, should be premised on concern for them. At the very heart of good lives, all our lives, we hope will be good ones, lie good relationships, and good relationships turn on having concern for other people. And concern in this particular connection has two components. One is compassion for people who are suffering, a tenderness towards those who live in anguish or pain or indignity and who need our help if they're not themselves able to do something about the situation they find themselves in. So one element is compassion. And the other element is respect for the autonomy of the individual, respect for the right that people have to make decisions about their own lives and indeed about their own deaths. This is a very, very important point because naturally enough questions about personal autonomy are not unqualified. We do limit people's autonomy in lots of respects because we don't like people to have the freedom, the liberty to harm others, for example, or to go on the rampage with a Kalashnikov. So there are ways in which we do ask people to restrain themselves, in which we do impose limitations on their self-determination. But in very important respects, marriage, for example, whether or not to have children, very fundamental decisions about how to live always provided, of course, that the harm principle is observed, that is, that we don't harm other people, or we try our very best not to harm other people, and we do that sincerely and responsibly. But with all those exceptions under the harm principle, the determination of the individual over his or her own life, the right to privacy, for example, right to express themselves in reasonable ways, and ultimately to make decisions about when and how they die, if they are in a situation of anguish towards the end of their lives, has to be respected. This is a human right that we accord to people, that they have this degree of autonomy. We say in our conventions on human rights, like the Universal Declaration of the UN and the European Convention on Human Rights, we give people a right to self-determination, a right to privacy, a right to be free from cruel and inhuman treatment. But also very early on in all these conventions, we give a right to life. And when you reflect a little bit on what a right to life is, you recognize that a right to life is not a right to a mere bare existence. If I put you in a cage and fed you bread and water, but kept you alive, that wouldn't be a life in any meaningful sense. When we talk about a right to life, we mean a right to a certain minimum quality of life, a life in which certain goals, expectations, certain activities which lend quality to the life as lived are available to the person doing it. And so when we accord a right to life, we accord with it a right to make some decisions about whether that life feels to the person living it to be worth living. And we should respect the judgment that people make about the quality of their own lives, especially when they're in very extreme circumstances. And by extreme circumstances, I mean, and I will principally focus on, someone with a terminal illness where there is no realistic chance of recovery, and where death is not far away, and where the person is suffering. And by suffering here, I'm going to mean more than just pain. Pain now is something that can be largely, not completely controlled, but there are palliative measures that can help people in these last terrible days and weeks of their lives. But there might be other forms of anguish too, and I invite you to consider just for a moment what it might be like to be incontinent and to have to be cleaned by somebody else every day, to have the indignity of that, perhaps to be choking or gasping for breath, perhaps to feel a tremendous amount of physical discomfort other than pain, to know that there is only one end to this, which is death, one release, and wanting to be helped, to be given what medicine can give people now, which is an easeful passage before things get worse, or before one has suffered too long in these ways. And quite often also, by the way, people who are in that situation and who are being given palliative care might choose not to be so heavily tranquilized that they're unable to relate to their families and loved ones, but who may want to be able to be fully conscious and say farewell to them, take their leave of them, and then be helped in a quiet and peaceful way to leave their suffering. So respecting the autonomy of individuals is respecting a right that they have to make that kind of decision. But of course it's a very important point that they should be in a position to make that kind of decision about themselves. There can be no question, and there is no question in this argument, of ever taking a decision of that kind on behalf of other people who haven't made a clear, settled intention to be helped to die, quite clear to independent parties, not to those people who are going to benefit from the will, or those people who think they're tiresome and want to free up a bed. None of that is in the offing here. That's not on the horizon of this discussion. This discussion is restricted just to people who have a clear-minded, settled intention to seek help to leave life because of the circumstances they're in, and where independent parties can see that their decision to that effect is a rational one, and one which is realistic in the circumstances. So it's a question about compassion on the one hand, the compassion that we feel towards people who are in those desperate circumstances, and a respect for their autonomy, their ability to choose a dignified and easeful ending to their sufferings if they wish it. But the autonomy in question has to be real autonomy, and that is very often in these debates when we talk about people who are suffering terminal illnesses, who may be very elderly, may have other difficulties also, we tend to be rather paternalistic and condescending towards them and discuss them in the "does he take sugar" tone of voice. If a person is genuinely autonomous and clear-minded, then they have responsibilities too. They've got responsibilities to the people they ask to help them to die. They have to be conscious of the difficulty, the dilemma that they're posing for other people. And in fact, in the debate at the moment, if you think, for example, of those people who have gone to court in the last decade or so asking for assurances from the Director of Public Prosecutions in England, the setup is different here, I think, asking for assurances that those who help them to die will not be prosecuted, and getting judicial review of the DPP's quite natural reluctance to give such assurances. But when you see that, you recognise that there is a very rich exercise of autonomy. Here are people who want the confidence, want the security of knowing that when things get too bad they will be helped to die, but not wanting to cause harm to those who might help them. Assisting somebody, assisted suicide in the law of England at any rate carries a maximum sentence of 14 years, which is a very severe punishment for what might have been an act of love. And so naturally the exercise of autonomy here involves an exercise of responsibility as well. So the agent is not merely a patient of a disease and of a medical process, but is also an agent. And when that agency is fully engaged in the last days, weeks or months of life in making this important choice about dying, we have all the more reason for respecting them and for respecting their autonomy. So we're not talking here, and it's very important to recognize that it would be a red herring in this debate to talk about people who are disabled or people who are, let us say, tetraplegic, but who have found a way of living and a set of interests and capacities. We're not talking here about taking decisions on other people's behalf, comatose people, elderly or demented people. We're not setting up committees to decide who shall live and who shall die. This is entirely a matter of people clear-mindedly asserting their own right to make choices in this important matter. And it is tragic in a way to think that in the last several years, in the last decade perhaps, over 100 people have gone from the shores of these islands to Switzerland in order to be helped to die because of a condition they have and which is unrelievable. And in at least many of those cases, the people who chose to die did so earlier than they would have wished, so that they could go to Switzerland and do it. Had it been legal in these islands to do it, they may well have lived a bit longer and had more opportunity to be with their families and their loved ones. It's sometimes the case that people commit suicide before they get to a position where they would need to be helped to die, because they're terribly worried about the legal consequences of relying on a spouse or a family member to help them die once they're no longer capable of picking up the pills themselves or lifting a glass of water. And in those cases also, life ends too early, ends before the person is himself or herself ready for it. So once again, if we legalized assisted dying, it may very well be that some people would have a little bit longer. And they would have it because they would have the confidence that they were going to be helped before matters became so intolerable as to be terrifying or unbearable. And indeed, the thought of allowing what we think of as natural processes to bring an end to life, or to rely on extremely heavy medication in the last days or weeks of an illness, just because one is too timid or lacks the moral courage or doesn't have the right framework to help people, when we are perfectly capable of helping them and out of compassion wish to do so. And in a situation where one has to remind people of this, where that compassion is very often exercised sub rosa, without any discussion or clarity in the situation, but the compassion of carers is such that they do help people to die. And in a way, to refuse somebody's request when somebody is in a situation of terrible anguish, and to refuse that is no different from condemning them to a very cruel punishment. No, I won't help you to die. You must go on suffering for the next days or weeks or months. It's like putting somebody into a torture chamber by refusing to help them. Well, There are a number of objections which are very often rehearsed in this debate, of course. One of them is that with the advance of medical science, we can never say with 100% certainty that an illness is terminal. There may be a miraculous recovery, or we may discover something at the last moment and be able to help someone. And that may indeed be the case. But in the realities, in the practicalities, when people are suffering indignities, suffering pain, suffering psychological anguish as a result of the situation they find themselves in, I think most responsible and serious people would recognize that in those cases, and where there is a clear settled intention, the honourable thing to do is to respond. The argument is sometimes put that if we were to legalise assisted dying, we would change attitudes in society, and it would be the beginning of a slippery slope. Well, I'm going to ask my very distinguished witness to talk a bit about the slippery slope argument. I've never myself been very fond of it. I've often thought that if somebody asked to eat a carrot, that I couldn't refuse on the grounds that they might want to eat 1,000,000 carrots, because they'd eaten one. So one has to be careful with slippery slope arguments, as one must also with the argument that says if you were to legalise assisted dying, we might not be able to control all the consequences of doing so, the unintended consequences argument, which alas is an extremely poor argument, because if we were worried about unintended consequences, we would never do anything whatever about anything at all. What instead we do, knowing that there are unintended consequences of things we do, is we try in our most intelligent and serious and responsible and careful way to anticipate some of those consequences and to put in place mechanisms for dealing with them. Sometimes the evidence from elsewhere is mentioned, and again I'm going to ask my distinguished witness to talk a bit about the facts of what's happened in those jurisdictions like Oregon, the state of Oregon, the United States of America, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, where assisted dying is legal. And as people sometimes trot out figures, they say since assisted dying was legalized in Oregon, the number of people who have chosen to be helped to die has increased fourfold, and it sounds terrifying. And of course the numbers are terribly small. They're like something like from 20 people to 49 people. And in the period in which assisted dying has been legal in Oregon, consistently since then, the number of deaths in Oregon from assisted medical procedures has been at or below 0.2%. And that figure is reflected elsewhere in other jurisdictions where this happens. Sometimes people say that palliative care is so good that it's not necessary to have an assisted dying provision. And it is true, we're very, very fortunate indeed in this country to have an excellent hospice system and excellent medical palliative treatment for people who are suffering. And for the great majority of people who don't want to die, the great majority of people who honour their families' wishes not to die, because of course, as you know, the majority case is that we don't want our very ill family members to leave us, and so we're often responsible for them living on longer because we want them to. And in this country we have an excellent system of help for such people, and the hospice system here is beyond parallel. It's wonderful. But it is not a magic wand. It doesn't help in every case, and it doesn't satisfy every person. And to say no one must have the right to make a choice on this matter because we have an excellent hospice system is to argue falsely. Another objection that's sometimes made is that people will feel that they are somewhat under pressure to ask for an assisted ending because it's legal and because it's available. They feel that their families want them to get on with it a little bit, or they feel they're being a burden, and that it's very hard for people to act autonomously in those situations because of the power of the medical profession or of the doctor or of the family. And this would be a reason for having a very careful discussion once we had settled the matter of principle and got down to questions of detail about how assisted dying is administered, to talk about taking the decision out of the carer-patient relationship to an independent body, able to assess the request of the patient, make sure that there isn't pressure, make sure that it is an autonomous decision and has been reached with clarity of mind. I have also to say that, of course, some of the well springs of attitudes about assisted dying have religious roots, and it may very well be that in the overall argument, religious sentiment plays a large part in this. The idea that that questions of life and death are for the deity or a deity and not for us. Now, this would be a much more impressive argument if the religious movements which took that view were also completely pacifist and had never used capital punishment to enforce orthodoxy. But even in the case of a religious movement which was always very protective of life, always and only very protective of life, even there one must ask, isn't it the case that a really deep compassion for the suffering of another person would lead one to help them? Very, very conscious of the fact that one of the arguments that was put during the height of the Inquisition some centuries ago was that by ending a person's life you were shortening their suffering in purgatory, and by stopping them from sinning even more and making things worse for themselves in a posthumous existence. And I applaud the motive of wishing to shorten their sufferings, and would only ask them to bring it to this side of mortality as well. There is an oddity in our system, we're very, very nearly at the end, thank you, Chairman. There is an oddity in our system which is that we accept people's right to say that they wish to receive no treatment when they have a terminal illness. So it's perfectly all right for people to say no treatment, but not all right for them to say, please give me some treatment that would help to shorten matters here. Why can't they choose to ask for positive rather than negative consideration? So I sum up by saying that the motives that lie behind the argument in favour of legalising assisted dying are motives of compassion and of respect for autonomy. And it is not outside the wit of human beings to think of a way of organising this which is as careful, as responsible, as tender to the interests of our fellow human beings as it can be, and result in really helping people who need our help. Well, I'm now going to call my witness, and as you've heard from our chairman, Professor Raymond Tallis is described in the literature for this event as a poet, novelist, philosopher, cultural critic, and he is indeed all those things, and in a very distinguished way. But much, much more to the point, he is an emeritus professor of geriatrics, and for 35 years was a hospital geriatrician. Professor Tallis, if I may just ask you for a yes or no question, and yes or no answer to my first question, which is this. You were, for about 3 years, the chairman of the Royal College of Physicians Ethics Committee, in 2003 to 2005 inclusive, at just the time that a bill was being introduced in the UK Parliament, in the House of Lords in fact, aimed at legalising assisted dying. And you agreed with your committee at that time to be in opposition to that move. That's the case, isn't it?
First time round, yes.
First time round, yeah. And you changed your mind.
I changed my mind,
and
yes.
I want to ask you about that change of mind, if I may, please. The argument that surely palliative care solves all the problems that we face in connection with end-of-life matters.
I mean, that was the first misunderstanding that drove me to the wrong conclusion. And in fact, it's obvious that palliative care doesn't solve all problems. You've described the kinds of situations where people really do not have their suffering alleviated. And that's implicit in the fact the kind of ploys that palliative care physicians often use, whether it's death by dehydration and starvation, whether it's continuous sedation, whether it's an over-liberal use of the double effect. All of those are implicit admissions within the UK, which we have, as you said, a very good palliative care service, that actually there are many patients whose suffering we can't palliate. It's very interesting if you look to international comparisons, because I think they're very instructive. If you look at Oregon, which, as you also mentioned, they have a Death with Dignity Act, which permits assisted dying, roughly under the same circumstances that Lord Joffe advocated in his bill. A very significant proportion of people who have availed themselves of assisted dying come from within hospice care, 80 or 90%. So that's a recognition that palliative care, even the best kind of palliative care, can't solve the problems of everyone.
And do you think if assisted dying were to become legal, would that undermine the palliative care system we've got now?
I don't think so. Again, you can look at international comparisons. If you look at the situation in Oregon, the proportion of people who are receiving hospice care has actually increased during the time they've had their Death with Dignity Act. One of the most striking examples actually is in Belgium, where prior to legislation for a more broader indication for euthanasia, the investment in palliative care was greatly increased. There was a huge investment, mainly to reassure people that assisted dying wasn't an alternative to good palliative care. And of course it isn't. It's just one instrument within the whole spectrum of good palliative care.
Of course, questions are also raised about doctor-patient relationships in a situation where it is legal for assisted dying to occur. I mean, do you think it would derogate in some way from that relationship?
Yes, there's been an assumption that if doctors have as part of their instruments, as it were, assisted dying, then it will break down trust between patient and doctor. Again, international comparisons are very useful. A big study done in Europe showed trust between doctors and patients at the highest level in Holland, who have very liberal laws, more liberal than I myself would advocate. And that's not at all surprising when you think about it. You know, if you know your doctor's not going to abandon you at the time of your greatest need, if you know also there's going to be a transparent and honest discussion about every aspect of end-of-life care, if end-of-life care is not going to be shrouded in ethical and clinical and legal fudges, then you might expect the level of trust in the doctor to be higher. And that's how it pans out in the case of the Netherlands.
Well, that's a very important point, of course, because it relates also to an anxiety people have about legalizing assisted dying, and that is the situation of vulnerable people and disabled people. Would you comment on that?
It's interesting how, in many ways, all the assumptions, the wrong assumptions I had, were actually empirical assumptions. They weren't a matter of principled assumptions. And this is, again, an assumption as a geriatrician I was very worried about. You know, my patients, almost by definition, are vulnerable patients. But if you look again at the studies in Oregon, the vulnerable people are actually relatively underrepresented amongst those who avail themselves of assisted dying. The people who tend to get assisted dying are rather feisty, bossy, used to getting their own way, middle-class, well-off people. And that's exactly what you would expect. People are used to having their autonomy respected, basically.
And that may very well be part of an answer to the slippery slope argument.
Yeah. I mean, the slippery slope, again, we looked at empirical data and find that it actually often works in reverse. For example, in Holland, since the liberalisation of legislation, the proportion of people who die as euthanasia without informed consent has actually fallen dramatically. And of course, in the UK, we wouldn't somnambulate, as it were, down a slippery slope. First of all, public opinion is against it. I mean, Anthony mentioned whether one will be in favour for assisted suicide of people who have appalling disabilities but who don't have a terminal illness. For example, the example of David Jamison, remember the rugby player who was tetraplegic, who felt the meaning of his life had gone. Now, I'm actually not in support of assisting suicide in that case. I'm only for support assisted dying. And it's interesting the general public is not in support either. Whereas a very steady 80 to 85% of people are in support of assisted dying, it falls dramatically to 40 or 50% in the kind of case of somebody who receives assisted suicide for a non-terminal condition. So you can see there's no public appetite to go down the slippery slope. And by the way, you could argue we're already halfway down one slippery slope. Clive Seal, who did a big study looking at patients, as it were, receiving assisted dying without informed consent, full consent. This is a study published in 2009, showed that 0.3% of patients who died had received assisted dying without the thing being discussed with them. Now, that isn't as sinister as it sounds, but it does indicate if there are slippery slopes to be had, we're on one of them already.
What does all this say about conceptions of the value of life? So, after all, very central to the medical profession, care or cure or care, and this embodies, of course, an attitude towards the value of individual human lives, putting a very, very high value on them.
Yeah.
Do you think that would change at all if we had assisted dying legalized?
If you respected my wish to have assisted dying to save me the last 2 or 3 weeks of appalling suffering, you're not in any way devaluing my life. You're taking what remains of my life at the value I put upon it. It doesn't mean to say I've devalued the preceding 70 or 80 years. Even less does it mean I devalue anybody else's life who wants to continue living. So I think the idea that acceding to someone's wish to have assisted dying under the very closely defined circumstances that we've discussed in no way generalizes to our view of the value of human life as a whole. So we don't move from assisted dying to the kind of appalling genocidal tragedies that we saw in the 20th century.
From your practical experience, this would be my last question, from your practical experience of working with people, many of whom, since you've been a geriatrician, have been approaching the end of life, do you feel that our attitude towards the end of life traditionally has, with this great sensitivity over whether we should hasten it in the case of people really suffering very badly and so on, do you think our attitude has matured enough now? Do you think we could devise laws which would really help practitioners and patients and their families to think seriously enough about this to do it well?
I think so, and also I think we're now mature enough to separate ageism, which says that somebody isn't worth looking after and giving the best care because they're old, from supporting somebody in their wish to have assisted dying, who in many cases will be old, because most people die when they're old. So I think we hopefully have reached a stage where we can have a mature debate about this and separate assisted dying from our other approaches to the care of people of any age.
Is there anything you want to add? Any points that you think need to be raised?
I think you've pretty well raised all the points that I hope you would raise.
Thank you very much indeed, very much.
Professor Grayling, Professor Tallis, thank you very much. Speaking in opposition to the question will be Professor John Haldane and Baroness Finley. Professor Haldane is the Professor of Philosophy at the University of St Andrews. He's published quite widely in the area of philosophy. He's also a well-known broadcaster and commentator and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Baroness Finley is a physician who's a former president of the Royal College of Medicine, and in addition was a member of the End-of-Life Care Strategy Board of the Department of Health in the period from 2007 to 2009. Could I first of all invite Professor Haldane to address us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Let me begin by congratulating the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Faculty of Advocates for convening this meeting this evening. I think it's very important that they should have done so, and I'm glad that they've taken the lead in the matter. And thank also Professor Grayling and Professor Tallis for their clear presentations, which I think will facilitate the I hope facilitate your thinking about these matters, but also I think in carrying it forward, the discussions you might have following this. We're going to proceed in a slightly different manner, which is that I'm going to give a presentation on these matters, and again in the spirit of trying to set out something of the issues and provide as much information as we can. Actually, I have a handout which corresponds to some of the PowerPoints that I'll be putting up before you, and that's coming around just now. While that's happening, let me just say our chairman, it was interesting when he was introducing the event, he oscillated slightly, I think, between the term trial and the term debate, and between motion and question. In fact, I think what we have is not either really quite a trial nor exactly a debate, but what I think it is you could think of it equally as an inquiry. We have a question before us, and we are, from different perspectives, wanted to try to provide an answer to that and say why we think the answer is as we propose. I show how we're dividing our contributions, Laura Finley and I, correspond actually rather broadly to the previous, the first half, in as much as I shall be speaking to philosophical issues and she will take up questions of palliative care and some of the matters that were touched upon about the experience in other parts of the world. At this point, I'm not going to be engaging points made by either Professor Grayling or Professor Tallis. The structure of this, I think, allows us an opportunity for a further summing up, and I think it's more appropriate at that point to perhaps to do that. And I'm sure that the Professor Grayling will want to do likewise. So the only thing that my slight sort of anxiety in this is that my grasp of the technology, slim as it is or weak as it is, doesn't defeat me. But anyway, what I want to speak to is this: that it could not, in principle, be demonstrated. This is the this is the negative to the question. It could not, in principle, be demonstrated that assisted dying, suicide, would never be open to abuse, and in any case, though sometimes well-intended, it runs counter to the deepest moral values and virtues. Now, so let me, in the course of this, really just introduce you. Some of you will be very familiar with all of this, but for those who aren't, I thought it might be useful to have this. So, assisted dying, first of all, versus assisted killing. Assisted dying, then, supporting the dying through care, comfort and medication to the point of death. Assisted suicide, acting with the intention of helping someone kill themselves, and then an act of voluntary euthanasia leading on from that, acting to bring about someone's death at their request. Now, what I want to propose and speak to is what I'm going to call here an ethic of humanity, solidarity and assistance. I will just pick up one thing that was said, which was that Professor Grayling introduced us rightly to the elements of compassion and autonomy, and I think that's exactly right. I want to agree about that, but I also want to bring in a third element, which is the value of human life, which he touched upon, but I want to make that more explicit in some ways. So what I'm concerned then is to propose is that an ethic of humanity, solidarity and assistance calls for providing compassionate support for the dying, but is incompatible with public policies that license the killing of innocent human beings, even with their consent or at their request. Now, I want to just point out here that the fundamental ethical stance towards human life is in the first instance protective, not promotional. That's to say, the first thing that one has to do is to protect a life, not go about necessarily making lives better. I'm saying that is something one might want to do also, but in the first instance it's protective. So the primary duty is negative, never to intend the death of an innocent. And here, for your interest, I'm not going to dwell on these, but there are three quotations from philosophers of the 20th century, rather interesting ones, beginning with Simone Weil, passing through Martha Nussbaum, and then on to Honora O'Neill. I will just draw your attention particularly to the Honora O'Neill, but what each of these touches upon is the aspect of human vulnerability. Legalizing assisted dying, that's to say assisted suicide, amounts to adopting a principle of indifference, writes O'Neill, towards a special and acute form of vulnerability. In order to allow a few independent folk to get others to kill them, we are to be indifferent to the fact that many less independent people would come under pressure to request the same. Indifference to others may appeal to those with an exalted view of their own independence, but it's not a principle for those who are vulnerable and need others' help. Assisted suicide in the UK law, just briefly again for your information to situate this, a very brief history pointing, I think, however, to some important truths. This matter has had more attention within the British legislative framework than probably anywhere else in the world. The starting point in recent times is the 1961 Suicide Act, which prohibits aiding and abetting suicide. It's in terms of that criminal proceedings would be brought. 1994, the House of Lords Select Committee on Medical Ethics, under Lord Walton's chairmanship, distinguished and defined physician-assisted suicide as the provision of assistance by a doctor to a competent patient who had formed a wish to end his or her life, distinguishing that from euthanasia as deliberate intervention undertaken with express intention of ending a life to relieve suffering, and which that might then be either voluntary, non-voluntary or involuntary. And the Walton Committee at that point rejected both physician-assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia, saying, "We do not believe these arguments for decriminalisation are sufficient reason to weaken society's prohibition on intentional killing. That prohibition is the cornerstone of the law and of social relationships. It protects each one of us impartially, embodying the belief that all are equal." When we proceed within the recent history in the Westminster Parliament, 2003, 4, 5 and 6, Lord Joffe's several attempts to see a private member's bill permitting assisted suicide, and those were variously defeated or withdrawn. Prior to the last of them, a House of Lords Select Committee was established on this very issue, the assisted dying for the terminally ill, bill under Lord Mackay of Clashfern, and it reported, it's a very extensive report, 1-volume report, 2 volumes of material that was submitted. It's inconclusive, but it's very helpful in setting out the arguments on either side. 2009 then, Lord Faulkner's amendment to the Coroners and Justice Bill, which would exempt someone, this is the cases of going abroad, a dignitas and so on, that also was defeated. And then most recently, and in this local parish, as it were, in the Holyrood Parliament, Margaret MacDonald's 2010 End-of-Life Assistance Bill, which was examined by the committee, criticised by the committee, and then defeated in a free vote by 85 to 16 with 2 abstentions. The committee wrote in their conclusion, the majority was not persuaded that the case had been made to decriminalise the law of homicide as it applies to assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia, and does not recommend the general principles of the bill to the Parliament. So let me come then to the ethical framework. Assisted dying versus assisted suicide. General elements of the ethical economy, as I shall put it. 3 elements that I think are relevant to this. 1 are values, secondly principles, third virtues. And I don't think here there need be any disagreement between the 2 philosophers this evening, at least so far as these as being elements of them. So think of values as goods of various sorts, think of principles as rules, broadly speaking, positive and negative, and think of virtues as dispositions towards those values and principles. And again, note the difference between value protecting, or value respecting, and value promoting. On the basis of value protecting, for example, truth can never be honoured by lying. In the case of value promoting, oddly enough, it could be, since one might lie in order to make it less likely that others will do so. You tell children, if you lie, God will punish you, or the little green goblin, or whatever else it might be. But the value protecting attitude is going to say, no, you honour truth by not lying. Now, assisted dying versus assisted suicide, continuing with the ethical framework, I want to come to 3 elements, and 2 of these have been touched on already. Autonomy, sympathy and compassion, and respect for life. Autonomy, variously defined or characterized, self-determination, self-choosing, and so on. Sympathy and compassion, following in the great Scottish tradition of Adam Smith, Hume and others, a felt response to the existence and condition of others. And respect for life, a principle of action, principally, in the first instance, one of restraint, and then of protection. Now, notice here, human lives are loci of 2 distinct kinds of value, substantive and qualitative. The value of life and value in life. The latter variable within and between the lives of individuals, the former not, and it's this that's the basis. The value of life is the basis, in the first instance, of respect for human life per se. Now, turning to these, if I just go back to that, so autonomy, sympathy and compassion, respect for life. Turning first of all then to autonomy, 2 problems with autonomy. This is not reason to reject autonomy, but to recognise difficulties. One is defining it, and the other one is determining its scope. With regard to definition, I mean, I'm not going to dwell on this. It's well known that there's a multitude of attempts to define it. It is, in fact, in philosophers' jargon, an essentially contested concept. Independence, self-formation, self-determination, self-assertion, and so on. So let me turn to scope, though the difficulty of defining it is material to the issue. Scope, it's not an unrestricted, and again this was allowed, it's not an unrestricted or overriding value in relation to others. For example, in connection with Mill's discussions of liberty, it has to be compatible with the autonomy of others and can't co-opt them for its own sake. Secondly, it has to recognise the fact of mutual dependence and commonality. Not every good that I have to consider is my good, and part of my good, in any case, derives from the common good, the shared common good of all. Thirdly, it has to be responsive to and respectful of other values, of other principles and of other virtues. The right to choose, obviously, does not make, thereby, what is chosen right. Autonomy can be wrongly exercised. And here's a couple of examples of when autonomy goes wrong. One, a case, or touches on a case which was discussed in Scotland, voluntary amputation. There are people who seek to have healthy limbs removed, surgically removed. This is a case of somebody becoming an amputee. If becoming an amputee made a person happy or even mentally stable, should we stand in their way? to such happiness or stability. This is by an amputee, this is written. This is a famous amputee from the UK who decided to lie down on a railway track and drink himself into unconsciousness. When he woke, he was an amputee. This person was frustrated enough with the medical community to take these drastic steps. They were declining to amputate a healthy limb. Voluntary murder, some of you will remember this case. The Armin News advertised on the internet for a young, well-built man who wanted to be eaten. Brandes replied, the unprecedented case proved problematic for German lawyers, who discovered that cannibalism is not illegal in Germany. No great surprise there, I suppose. Instead, they charged him with murder for the purposes of sexual pleasure and with disturbing the peace of the dead. The accused, however, gave the defence that his victim actually agreed to be killed and eaten. What's interesting also about this is that after that, the German cannibal met 5 other men who responded to his internet advert. Voluntary slavery, voluntary female genital mutilation, voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide. It seems to me in each case we have to ask the question that somebody chooses to exercise their autonomy is not in and of itself sufficient. We have to make a judgment. So the core ethical case against assisted suicide has 3 targets. One, what I'll call shuffling from one foot to another. Secondly, conflating value in life and value of life. And thirdly, forgetting the common good. Shuffling from one foot to another. If autonomy is what's at issue, why restrict it to the cases of diminished quality in life? And who decides in any case what the standard of that should be? If quality of life is what matters, then why restrict physician or other killing to assisted suicide or even to voluntary euthanasia? As with standing on one foot, sooner or later the case falls to the ground. Secondly, conflating value in life and value of life. Why confine sympathy and compassion to the promotion of positive experiences and the elimination of negative ones? The deepest virtues attach to affirming life in circumstances of suffering and of death. Life is still to be affirmed even in its worst condition. There is still something at the heart of that to be acknowledged and respected, which is life itself, the life of an individual themselves. Finally, forgetting the common good. Assisted suicide draws others into the practice of killing, both as agents, doctors, nurses, relatives, friends and strangers, and as patients, the insecure, the unassertive, the dependent, the asset and inheritance holders, the resource and care consumers. What I should do ought to take account of others, and sometimes that means enduring in order that others not do wrong or that others not be wronged. Sometimes one has to sacrifice one's own state in order to secure the protection of others, both that they not be co-opted into doing wrong or that others be wronged. So conclusions. First of all then, ethics is not just about making good. It involves living with the bad. An ethics of solidarity, as described by Simone Weil, Martha Nussbaum and Honora O'Neill in the quotations I provided you, an ethics of solidarity, humanity and assistance point to assisting people in their dying, not bringing about that death, not killing them. Secondly then, it could not in principle be demonstrated that assisted dying or suicide would never be open to abuse. It simply could not be demonstrated. And in any case, though sometimes well intended, it runs counter to the deepest moral values and virtues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Holby.
And now I'm going to, I don't know whether any time remained in that, or was there any, if there were any time, I'm happy to hand it over as part of the contribution that might not be made by Baroness Finley. But I'm going to invite Baroness Finley now to speak to you, and in the areas of her own expertise, speaking about palliative care and also the question of the matters in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Baroness Finley.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you. I doubt that we'll need to put the lights down, so perhaps we could try to stay as we are. I think this is me. Let's see. Thank you. Well, you had a motion before you to look at, and I would just like you to go back for a moment to the words of that motion while I pull this up. because it is so much not in the real world. It is so much an imagination where everything is completely perfect, that it strikes me that you can either say that you believe that the world can, in fact, be totally perfect, in which case you support the motion, or you recognise that the world is not totally perfect, in which case perhaps the only thing to do is to abstain. Given that you have two cards of different colours, perhaps if you take that more logical view and realistic view of the world out there, then possibly I would suggest that returning two cards simultaneously might be the only way you can register to abstain. But there we go. It is a suggestion to you. But we're talking about assisted suicide, and we're talking about whether it is safe. That's what we're addressing. This isn't about morality or religion or about medicine or personal views. I would suggest to you this is about public safety under the law. That's a website if you want later to go and have a look at some of the papers written by people, including one by Nora O'Neill. So if you're going to have safeguards under the law, how safe is safe? And do the safeguards match the gravity of the risk? Indeed, are the safeguards realistic in the real world? After all, in the real world, we abandoned hanging because sometimes the wrong people were hung. We accept that the real risk is that some people who've committed the most heinous crimes will get out of prison early, perhaps, and go on to commit crimes again. But that is a balanced risk that in society we accept because we live in the real world. I was part of the select committee in 2005 that looked at Lord Joffrey's bill, and I do want to address the issue, the practical issue of safeguards and whether you can ever have things 100% perfect. We made recommendations, and it's interesting that those advocating changing the law on assisted suicide have ignored these. We pointed out in our report, because it was pointed out to us, that terminal illness in the reality of clinical practice is almost impossible to define. Indeed, in medicine there is very, very little that is cured. And the College of Physicians, in their evidence to us, backed up what the College of GPs said, which is that in the last minutes, hours or days of life, you can get your guesstimate reasonably accurate, but otherwise it's pretty hopeless. Indeed, we know that even where the last 48 hours of life is predicted, in 3% of cases, the doctors and nurses will be wrong. We cannot predict the length that somebody will live. Think about Megrahi, prostate cancer. Perhaps the course of history might be slightly different if he hadn't been predicted to have a 3-month prognosis, because he certainly seemed to be alive and well at the last time he was seen in public. Mental capacity. The problem about mental capacity is cognitive impairment. Now, an ordinary psychiatric examination probably won't pick up impaired decision making if it's done. Interestingly, in Oregon, they did initially refer about a third of patients for psychiatric evaluation, but that has dropped to 0. In the Oregon experience now, and there is a good study done by Ganzini, where she followed patients right through to their death, showed that 1 in 6 of those patients who went right through to have physician-assisted suicide had an undetected, undiagnosed and untreated depression. Many of these patients who are ill are on drugs such as steroids, which distort their thinking. They're on opioids that may distort their thinking as well. And we know that even in diseases like motor neuron disease, 30% of patients actually have an impairment of capacity, even though that is not a condition commonly thought of, unlike dementia, as impairing capacity. What about informed consent? Help the Hospices pointed out to us, and I'd say my clinical practice completely concurs with this, that the experience of pain control is radically different from the promise of pain control. Nobody is claiming that any treatment in medicine is 100%. There is no such thing. I am talking about the real world. That motion was talking about some airy-fairy world. There is no treatment that is 100%. Of course there isn't. There would have been no deaths in hospitals, no Clostridium difficile, none of these things if that was the case. What about voluntariness? How do you judge that somebody is really acting voluntarily? If the witness is not a family member, then how do they know? I will make the assumption that every single one of you is acting voluntarily by coming here tonight and is under no influences whatsoever. But I don't know. You all look to me as if you came here voluntarily. And what about the use of drugs? Drugs that are prescribed, the condition that pertains when a patient is assessed may have changed by the time they go to take their medication. And the time lag might be quite long. Even though Oregon has stipulated in its legislation a 6-month limit, a 6-month prognosis from request to taking the drugs, there is the longest case recorded has gone on for 2 years and 9 months. An awful lot changes with time. So what are the underlying principles that can affect safety during that time, from when it is made, the request is made, and perhaps somebody does receive permission to have their appointment with death, and when that occurs? That assumes a black and white world, but actually most of medicine is shades of grey. And I would suggest to you, and I'll quote this from the patient who was dying, and I'm sorry the pale blue probably doesn't show up brilliantly, who said 4 years after she was expected to die within 2 or 3 weeks, 4 years after she was extremely angry that she couldn't have assisted suicide, and 4 years after she was in a hospice unable to get out of bed, but after having had 3 years and about 10 months living completely independently at home, I am an old woman, 88, and at the end of my life. In bed and unable to do, she was indeed in bed, but able to receive and find an unexpected serenity in receiving. A week ago my wish to die resurfaced, yet my ability to live resurfaced again. She died very shortly after saying this, writing this at home. Most people in reality are in the middle group. They're not just the really strong-minded or those who are dead set against. And the law has to protect the whole of the population. Why do people go for assisted suicide? Well, all the evidence from Oregon is it is fear of the future, fear of what lies ahead is much more powerful than actually what's happening today. People who are in pain want to get out of that pain. They're frightened of dignity. It was referred to, excuse me, I've got a glass of water, about incontinence. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but those of you in the room who are over the age of 60, I would anticipate that probably about 90% of you have experienced little episodes of incontinence and leaking. That's just the way it is as you get older. But it doesn't mean that you've lost your dignity. It doesn't mean that you're no longer the person that you ought to be. The way that people behave to you is what influences your perception of dignity and how you view yourself and how you behave. There are people who certainly have to be toileted completely for years. They are out working. Some of them are members of the House of Lords, but they need assistance with toileting. Well, they are, and they speak quite openly about it. We have some who are in wheelchairs, and they're very, very clear about the problems of bowel care, etc. What about the influence of the doctor, though? I'm a woman doctor, and I'm still working. I still do on call, and that's why I put a woman on the front of the tandem, because I think it is like riding a tandem. It's the doctor that holds the handlebars, actually, and steers the way that the conversation goes. And when a patient says, "I just want to die," the way that the doctor responds, and it's 90% of that is non-verbal communication, are the messages that the patient picks up. So which road do you go down? You can say, "So you really want to die," gently, compassionately, and explore it. And in jurisdictions where the law has changed, you can process that request. And in so doing, you as a doctor give a subliminal message that you're right to think that you'd be better off dead. Or you can go down a different road by responding, "What is making today so terrible? Is there anything at all that we can do to improve today, however little, however trivial?" And in that process, you give the message, you are worth me working hard to improve things. What about the real world then, the real world of medicine? Most therapeutic medicine is about large numbers of people every day with decisions that require choosing between options available. Options such as should they have more treatment or not, should they have a gastrostomy or not, should they go for an operation or not. The real choice people want is to not be ill in the first place. And medicine is there to guide them through difficult times, through those cross currents, those turbulent times with careful nuancing, responsible nuancing, listening to the patient, not taking perhaps the easy way out. It is that trust in the doctor-patient relationship that is fundamentally the problem. Patients trust their doctor because they have to. If any of you on the way home end up in A&E, in the infirmary, you have to trust the staff there. You have no choice. You're not going to sit and ask them, are they really competent or whatever. We trust our GPs because we have to. If we don't, we swap GPs. But there is a trust there which is enforced on people by being ill. Sadly, sometimes that trust is betrayed by bad care. But I don't think that we should say that bad care is the reason to end people's lives. So I would suggest to you that in the real world, patients are not always rational and cool-headed. Many people fluctuate, are subject to influences, all kinds of subtle influences on them. Doctors are not all good communicators. No, I know they're not. That's something that we need to address. But do we change the law on assisted suicide because doctors are communicating badly? And families aren't always loving and selfless as they appear. One example I'd like to give you is a woman who we were absolutely convinced, her very anxious family were really in quite a state. They kept on asking for her to have more and more pain control, and whenever we went to her, she said she didn't need any more morphine, thank you, she was fine. Her birthday came, the celebration was a bit muted, and we thought, well, they were hardly going to go and celebrate her last birthday, a bit like the Last Supper. So it was understandable, and they were a loving family. About 10 days later, they hadn't been visiting that much, and one of the nurses saw that the woman was quite low and was drinking a hot chocolate with her, and said to her, it's a pity your family don't come in and see you as much, perhaps they can't get in as much. And she said, well, actually, my fixed-term life insurance policy expired on my birthday, and they're £11,000 worse off. We were all completely taken in that this was a really loving family. And of course, the pressure for her to have more morphine, I could see now, was because they thought that they might be hastening her time. It's worth noting, though, that actually morphine doesn't kill people unless you take massive overdoses or give it like Shipman did. It's a remarkably safe drug. But we have criminal laws, not because most people behave well. If everybody behaved well, we wouldn't need criminal laws, if that was the ideal world. But we have it because a few people do not behave decently. That is why the law is there, to protect those people in the middle ground who perhaps really aren't strong enough to say for themselves how they feel, or are subject to influences for all kinds of reasons. Now, does human nature find loopholes? You've heard about those jurisdictions where the law has changed. Well, what about illegal action by doctors? Life ending without an explicit request. Seal's paper, already referred to, showed that in the UK, indeed, there may be life ending at 0.3%, extremely low, quote from the paper. And Seal said in his conclusion, doctors attending deaths rarely felt the UK law had inhibited or interfered with their preferred management of patients, or for new laws in this area to be desirable. But he also pointed out that illegal action by doctors, even though the law had changed to allow euthanasia, in Holland was recorded at 0.9%, which is higher than in the UK, and in Belgium at 2.26%, which is much higher in a country that's changed its law. And is there a culture change? Well, looking at Belgium again, with a population of about 10 million, and Flanders is about 60% of the population, they have a reporting rate inside their law of only just over 50%, 52.8%. and especially low reporting for people over the age of 80, suggesting that actually there is an assumption that, well, even if you have not stuck with the law, you really don't need to report it in the over 80s because it's kind of expected that they'll die anyway. And if we translate those figures, roughly, because the population of Scotland is about 5.5 million, I think, you come out at these kind of figures that I put underneath, based on their rates that they found from 2003, but they've gone up into 2009 during the change of their law. And what about Oregon? We've heard about Oregon. Oregon, the numbers certainly are low. The population of Oregon, though, is only a little bit bigger than Wales, and Wales is pretty small compared to Scotland. But the number of lethal prescriptions has gone up year on year, and the number of deaths have gone up year on year. So something is happening, something is changing, because you would expect it to have plateaued off early if this was just the very strong-willed. But there's something changing when you normalise this in society. And what about an update in the UK? Seal did a repeat study and found that the non-voluntary had fallen from 0.38 to 0.3. So we're not going up, we're going down. Found absolutely no evidence of physician-assisted suicide in the UK. So we really don't have the number of illegal euthanasias as are found in those countries that have changed their law. And if you want to use the term assisted dying, which is a euphemism to encompass assisted suicide and euthanasia, in his conclusion he stated that the instance of assisted dying is very low indeed. But we live in a real world. We've had a highly unrealistic question put to you tonight. It's up to you whether you decide that you want to declare that you stay in the airy-fairy world or whether you want to be realists. That's your decision. But no law is completely safe. If there's a guarantee that it's never open to abuse, but such guarantee can't be given, and the question is not real-world proofed. The real question is whether the degree of safety relates to the risk being taken. And the risk being taken is the risk of ending life months or years earlier than it otherwise would have been. This is not about the last hours of life. This is about taking a decision because you misguidedly think the person in front of you is dying, but you can be wrong. And mistaken death is irreversible, and that's why you need a very high level of assurance in law. And the safeguards proposed to date in all the legislation that we've seen within the jurisdictions of the UK, and indeed has been demonstrated in those that have changed the law, are not watertight. And that is part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Finley. Ladies and gentlemen, you will of course be masters of the fact, but I can claim at least on this one occasion to be master of the law. There is just one point I would make. Professor Haldane referred to the Suicide Act 1961. That is of course the law of England and Wales, but it is not the law of Scotland. Under the law of Scotland, and subject to the views of one 17th century commentator, it is generally acknowledged that suicide is not a crime according to the common law. Of course, assisting in suicide would be a crime in Scots law, and it would probably be viewed either as culpable homicide or as reckless endangerment of life. So I don't take away in any sense from the force of Professor Haldane's argument. I merely observe that one particular facet dealt with the law south of Hadrian's Wall rather than with the law within this jurisdiction. What I would like to do now is to invite, first of all, Professor Grayling to give a summary of his position and that of Professor Tallis in light of the arguments that have been advanced. Professor Grayling, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I won't summarise the argument that Ray and I have already put. I'll just respond, if I may, to a couple of points which have been made. And with the very greatest respect to Baroness Finley, whose argument really turned on the uncertainties that infect us in the real world. We can't be certain whether somebody is really competent. We can't be certain when somebody is going to die. We can't be sure if the decision they've taken is really voluntary and so on. I think in the real world, quite often, we can make those sorts of judgments. I'm pretty sure that we can say that unless you were dragged kicking and squealing here by a spouse or a partner today, most of you are here voluntarily, and that there are plenty of sensible guidelines for understanding these things, which I think should encourage us to the view that the anxiety that there would be very small numbers of people who are malicious or malevolent in their attitudes, or people who fool us into thinking that they're competent when they're not, that in order to make sure that we don't fall foul of those very few cases, we're going to have a blanket proscription against people being able to make choices about what happens at the end of their life. The same point, I think, really applies to much of what John has said. And by the way, he gave you an extremely elegant philosophy lecture, very, very beautiful PowerPoint, and it had in it all the elements of some of the very best tricks of rhetoric, if you don't mind my saying, John, which I recommend to you if you want to win arguments. Like, for example, you bring in voluntary amputees and people who want to be eaten by other people and so on, examples of highly irrational, pathological individuals who are the very opposite of the rational and clear-thinking person we have in mind, who is choosing to end their life in the case of suffering. That won't do. I very much agree that providing compassionate support for people who are suffering terrible illness or pain or difficulty is exactly what we should do. The general tenor of what John was saying about our attitude towards the dying is right. It's just that he stops one step short. Death is the ultimate palliation for suffering. And for those people who really are in a terrible situation, not just a bit of over 60s leaking, but in the really, really awful situation of soiling themselves every day and having to be cleaned up by other people. I mean, you know, the psychological anguish of that is very difficult to imagine. But also some of the other discomforts that people experience when they are terminally ill. These are considerations which really do elicit our compassion. And I don't think that there is any argument in any moral theory I can think of which forbids help in the extreme to people who tremendously need it, if your care for that person is genuinely tender, if you really do feel that there is something that you could do to alleviate suffering, you would do it. It's a striking fact, and it's a hard point to make this, but it's a striking fact that we are much, much kinder to our pets than we are to members of our own family sometimes. I think that the important point here to remember is that we're not talking about an indiscriminate license to kill people who are inconvenient or disabled or old or occupying a bed. This is not in the picture at all. We're thinking about people who have this clear and settled intention, and we seem to be suggesting that we should forbid them that choice, that we should deprive them of that right, because we're afraid that there might be one or two little loopholes where something bad happens. Everything that we human beings do carries a risk. We evaluate the risk. We ask ourselves the question, should we be prepared to take that risk in the interests, in the much greater interests of really providing help where help is needed? And in the case of Oregon, I try to anticipate the objection that in Oregon the law had been passed and so more people did it. Well, of course, because they have the opportunity, and a human right is being honoured and wishes are being respected, and this seems to me to be some advance. You only have to consider that some of the technologies and drugs available to medicine now are of very, very recent date. We're thinking of less than a century. I mean, until antibiotics came into existence, doctors mainly had the bedside manner and rather little else, and that they had a few slightly violent instruments for people who wanted to be amputated for good reason rather than bad reason. But really it was the question of kindness rather than other things. So in the past, helping somebody to die might have involved a certain amount of unpleasantness, a certain amount of violence, putting a pillow over somebody's head. But nowadays it's possible to help somebody in those very, very few particular cases where a clear-minded person really does want help. It's possible to do it in a way which is extremely civilized and very easeful. And to deny that resource to people seems to me to be a cruelty. Chairman, is there any possibility at all that I might ask my witness, who is a man with facts at his fingertips, to comment on one or two of the points that were made?
If you're going to do so within the matter of a minute or so, that would be welcome.
Will you speak very fast, Ray?
I just have to deal with Laura's use of the international figures. First of all, if we look at Oregon, 49 people in 2008 availed themselves of assisted dying. 9,500 people discussed with their doctors the possibility of assisted dying, and you can see a lot of people entertain that and gain great comfort from it. Very few proceeded then to get a prescription and then to cash a prescription. So I think that's very important to look at the overall picture of assisted dying as part of the dialogue about end-of-life care. The figures that Laura figures from Holland were alarming but entirely misleading. The figure of 0.9% refers to 1990. That figure is actually halved since the introduction of legislation, so it's down to actually 0.5% by 2005. So that's a good example of the beneficial impact of legislation on illegal behaviour. One final point is I just have to pick up on this question of capacity. Elsewhere in law and in medicine we have a default assumption of capacity. Here, the default assumption apparently is people have no capacity, which seems to me to undermine human dignity in an extraordinary way. I'll stop when you tell me to stop. Have I had my whack, as it were?
You may take a few seconds longer.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on Professor Haldane's point about affirming life in circumstances of suffering. And I've seen too many doctors in my life who've borne other people's suffering with great heroism. Other people suffering with great heroism. And it is the easiest thing in the world to walk away from the bedside of someone who's in hell. And that isn't at all life-affirming. And sticking with someone to the very end is extraordinarily uncomfortable, keeping the therapeutic alliance alive while somebody is in great suffering is most uncomfortable. And so I'm not too sure I actually resonate to the ethics in that particular statement. One final point is, when it comes to the real world, I too, Laura, have spent a lot of time in it. I spent 37 years in it as a doctor. So I guess it's just different patches of the real world rather than a real world and unreal one.
Thank you, Professor. Could I then invite Professor John Haldane to sum up? And as the first set of speakers went slightly off-piste, I think we will allow Baroness Finley to speak for a few minutes as well.
Yes, thank you. And you saved me the task of summarising what you might want to say in reply to that. So let me just say, look, what we've heard this evening, I think we're fortunate, in fact, to have had this material set before us, because these are matters about which we really do need to come to decisions, however provisional they might be. Now, Laura Finley emphasised certain practical matters and emphasised the idea that we're dealing with real-world issues here, and that, of course, is important, but it might have had the consequence of suggesting, though I think this was not her intent, that perhaps what Professor Grayling and I might have to say falls in the area of abstract speculation. But he and I are both, I think, deeply and commonly committed to the practicality of philosophy, at least see philosophy in one of its central aspects as being an essentially practical matter. And it was in that connection that he introduced, rightly, the concept of autonomy and compassion and so on, and I also introduced the question of the value of life. Because we can't really formulate these questions, let alone try to answer them, unless we do have a grasp of the concepts with which we're dealing. Now, part of my point was to say that the concept of autonomy, for example, is actually a very difficult concept. It's difficult to determine what exactly goes into it and what its scope is. And so it really is to the point then to actually press the question, on what constraints there might be upon autonomy. And that's why these examples, which they're not fanciful, but actually examples of the autonomous amputee and so on, actually do bear upon it, because they raise the question of what are the scope and what are the limits of the application of autonomy, and to what extent can others co-opt us into their actions. So we really have to think, start off with those cases and then progress. That's why I actually had assisted suicide came at the end of the list. Think about these cases. For example, there are circumstances in which people volunteer, exercise their autonomy and request, for example, the removal of the clitoris. That this is actually done for no medical reason whatsoever, but perhaps that one's culture is one in which this is valued and so on. And female genital mutilation is a fact, and it's something in which people have sought to exercise their autonomy and ask that there be medical practices provided to institute that. Now, I take it that one would probably respond to that by saying that this is an unreasonable exercise of self-determination. So the question of self-determination in and of itself only does so much. And that's why I said this is shuffling from one foot to the other. What actually at the end of the day is meant to carry the weight here? Is it the question of self-determination, or the question of what that determination is exercised towards? If you go the question of determination, does it, then there seems to be no constraint. If you do it this question of quality, then why restrict it to the circumstances in which self-determination itself is sought to be exercised, whatever that might be? But what I want to just shift finally to is this, and this was really the burden, or at least part of what I wanted to say. I do think that in thinking about these matters, the current state of reflections on them, at least from the side that advocate assisted suicide, is one that in some respects actually is a reflection of a broader feature of our culture, which is a kind of demand. I don't want to put it in terms of consumerism, but it is a culture of high expectation, if I can put it that way, that we've become used to complaining if things actually aren't as we want them to be. Now, the fact of the matter is that most human lives are not as people would want them to be. We live our lives under conditions that were not chosen by us and over which we have very little control. And so when I talked about an ethic that is life-affirming, what was said in response to that was not actually to dispute it, but to say it's very difficult. But of course that's precisely my point. It is very difficult to affirm life all the way through to its final and often horrible stages. But I think we need to be more ethically demanding upon ourselves. I think that this is an invitation to slide away from the difficult, to ease ourselves out of ethical positions by simply, or ethical challenges, by simply bringing the circumstance to an end. And I don't think that's in the interest of human values more extensively. So with that, I'm happy to leave it to Laura to say whatever she wishes to say. Thank you.
Baroness Finley, would you like to just address us for a few minutes in summation? Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come back. As for discussing death and dying, it happens day in, day out in the UK. Indeed, I would say that it should happen to every patient who's terminally ill, and they should be able to discuss their death and dying. There's absolutely no evidence that it doesn't, but there is a lot of evidence from those conversations in the UK that patients who are in despair and are saying, I can't go on, I just want to end it all, give me something to end it all, when you address the problems in their care and you address their fears, those requests vanish. And I could give you lots of stories, but we haven't got time to do that now. So that dialogue has to address patients' fears. That is good care. Communication has got to improve, I would agree. I'm not going to data hurl over Seal's paper from 2006. That was the data, but even if it's wrong, you do have to look at the Belgian data. And the Belgian data I find really worrying, that they have such a low reporting rate within their law when they've changed the law. In terms of capacity, the issue around capacity is the amount of capacity you need has to be proportionate to the decision you're taking. And yes, there is an assumption of capacity in normal, everyday clinical practice, but you have to reassess the capacity each time for the size of the decision you're taking. So your ability to choose what you're going to eat, or where you're going to be, or what you want in terms of being in bed, out of bed and so on, is quite different to whether you're going to undergo a complex treatment, and certainly quite different as to whether you're going to end your life. In terms of palliative care, which was spoken about, it's worth noting that specialist palliative care, as we have in the UK, does not exist in Oregon, nor does it exist in the Netherlands. There is no such specialty there. There has been training and education around the whole world in palliative care. It has gone up just as much in France and places that have not changed their law as it has in places that have, because Britain has led the way with specialist palliative care. There is some in Belgium, but their training would not be recognised against our competency framework. Am I advocating walking away when somebody is in hell? Absolutely not. The clinician has their duty to go back and redouble and redouble and redouble their efforts. It is easy to take shortcuts in care. It is easy to clock in. I have sat in on consultations and observed consultations where euthanasia has been discussed in those jurisdictions where you can discuss it. What has struck me is that when you start to go down the road of processing the request, you're going in a diametrically opposite direction of all of your efforts to improve the distress and mitigate against whatever is undermining quality of life. You need to be imaginative, sometimes completely outside medicine, quite often completely outside medicine, to restore people's quality of life and sense of personhood. And then my last point I would like to make is that sadly there have always been and there always will be suicides. What we're talking is whether we legalise the assisting of the suicide by somebody else. And what has struck me all the time is that one's talking about drugs when actually there are lots of other ways that people can kill themselves. Sadly, we do have a lot of carbon monoxide deaths, but all the evidence is that those are extremely rapid and maybe more rapid than deaths by drug overdose with barbiturates. And we're not talking about more morphine and titrating it up. We're talking about a massive overdose of barbiturates, and if you do it by injection with euthanasia, following up possibly with curare to paralyse somebody so they can't breathe at all, and then they die. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about supporting and going up and increasing doses, and knowing that you may be taking a risk in so doing, but that's a balanced risk, and that is one that is part of good medicine. I just am not sure that it is good to incorporate this in medicine. And if you are going to go down this road, then keep it out of clinical care, because you will undermine the direction of trying to improve quality of life for those who perhaps deserve to have it improved. Thank you.
Laura. Now, could I invite our speakers to come up and face their jury, as it were? John, do you want to join Baroness Finley on my right? Mr. Tallis? Now, I wonder if I might simply pose one question to, first of all, Professor Grayling and Professor Tallis. You talked about self-determination, the right to life, respect for autonomy. Would it be the case that the logic of your analysis applies equally to the 25-year-old who is healthy but wants to end his life, as it would to the terminally ill 85-year-old?
The answer is yes, but understood that the healthy 25-year-old can end his own life by his own actions. I mean, I think in confronting a situation like that, of course, your first duty would be to try to dissuade him, try to find out what the problem is and the rest of it. But there's no involvement of somebody else assisting the person to do it. And if they did, I think it would be very misguided of them, given the facts you've set up, young and healthy. What we're talking about are people who are in a very distressed state physically, and there is no reasonable expectation that they're going to cease to be. They're not in a position to be able to take any action themselves, and they need help to do it. And that's a very, very different situation. There's a call upon one's active compassion in a way that there isn't in the case of the 25-year-old, although one in the end recognises that if you're serious about granting people their autonomy, and I accept all John's points about the difficulty of it, but, you know, between the concepts of autonomy on the one hand and our generalised paternalism on the other that places a blanket prohibition on people exercising choice over themselves, that there isn't much of a gap. So in the case that you describe, I think you ultimately would have to recognise that all of us have that final decision in our own hands. And it was once honoured, of course, in ancient Rome, for example.
Could I just pick up on that? I mean, I can see the surface validity of John's point, which is, of course, if you subscribe to the principle of autonomy, why should you ever want to limit it? If autonomy is an intrinsic good, just let it go, expand indefinitely. So how can you rationally place constraints on autonomy? How can you, for example, decide you see a chap on a bridge wanting to jump off, sort of extreme example, why don't you just say, go down your mate, exercise your authority? And the answer is none of us would do that, precisely for the reason that Anthony said. We have no idea of the background to this person jumping off the bridge when it is someone who's terminally ill, who has appalling symptoms, who has a very poor prognosis, and whom every endeavour to palliate those symptoms has failed. Then you've got a totally different situation. But let's suppose we do agree that autonomy is a good. Then what assisted dying is offering an expansion of autonomy, but not a further expansion of autonomy to the point where the harm principle kicks in, and the greater harm then comes from expanding autonomy. Final point, we believe in free speech, and we dislike hate speech. But it's very unclear at the point at which free speech, which is desirable, becomes hate speech, which is appropriately criminal. We always have to dichotomize across a continuum. And this is one example of where you dichotomize across a continuum. But it seems to me that is a good place where we would confine assisted dying to say, yes, we believe in the expansion of autonomy, but not the infinite expansion of autonomy.
Thank you. Professor Haldane, Baroness Finley, can I ask, from your perspective, do you regard life as a gift or as a right?
Thank you. Could I just say one thing which I meant to, because I meant to respond about the 1961 Suicide Act. Could I just pick that up very briefly, which is to say that I wasn't overlooking the fact that within Scotland it's not, that suicide is not a crime. But what I did want to point out was that the legislative activity that has gone on in the last few years until 2010 has all been directed at either introducing amendments to that or exemptions to it or other legislation. So the principal activity with which people would be familiar is actually directed towards the legacy of the 61 Suicide Act. I don't regard life as, what was it, a gift or a right? Do I regard life as a gift or as a right? I'm not sure that I would choose either of those, actually. I mean, I don't, for reasons with which some of you will be familiar, I think the language of gift is not particularly helpful. I understand why people sometimes use it, often as an expression of a kind of piety, the sense of givenness, as it were, that this is unbidden in some way. It's certainly true that we're not self-creating. We didn't bring ourselves into being, and so I think some people's natural response, whether it be religious or otherwise, is to somehow think of life as something that is received. But of course, it couldn't be received unless it was something there already. So I think the language of gift is not actually ultimately a coherent language. Whether one regards, nor do I regard life as a right. I mean, again, I'm not even sure what that would mean to say that life was a right, as if it was something that could be claimed in its absence. I'd say that life is a fact, and what I have been keen to emphasize is a certain kind of realism, which is to say an ethical realism in the following sense, that the ethical has to be shaped in the face of vulnerabilities, contingencies, the fact that our lives are dependent upon one another, they're shared with one another, and so on. And so I would say that life is a fact, and the ethics of solidarity, as I've been concerned to try to elaborate it, is a response to that fact.
Can I comment? I would agree. Then I had written down fact, because I think life is a fact. Everyone in this room, I hope, is still alive. And we recognise when somebody is irreversibly dead. There is that little phase, of course, where you don't know whether it's reversible or not, so you try and resuscitate them, but that's separate. But we also have the Human Rights Act, because we recognise the importance of respecting the life of others and of not harming that life by others. That's the principle behind it, but it is a fact. If we look, though, at those people who have gone through with assisted suicide, and indeed those people who were spoken about who've gone to Switzerland, who've decided to get rid of that fact of their life, which was their decision, they're not the people who are desperately ill and really at the end of their lives. And if you look at the Oregon ones, and there are videos of them up on YouTube, they're not desperately ill at the end of their lives. They're people who have decided and been assisted in cutting off their life with however long lies ahead. And that may be years. The longest patient that I've got who was desperate to die and who I thought had a prognosis of 3 months or so, as did 3 other senior doctors. So there were 4 of us, 3 consultants and his GP, all thought in the October he'd be dead by Christmas, was in 1991. In 2001, despite having looked as if he was dying, he phoned me because his wife was diagnosed with a carcinoma of the pancreas and was then dying. Last summer, I went to his daughter's wedding, which he was at. He's in his wheelchair, he couldn't take her down the aisle, but I was spectacularly wrong. And he said, Elora, don't go there. Where would my kids have been? The thing is that however much you think you know the prognosis, you don't. And the people who are asking in that early phase. When I have conversations with patients about, I just want something to end it all, it is before they are in that last phase of dying. They're not, by and large, the people who are in that last phase of dying who are asking. What they need is good care that respects them, that allows them to be at home and looks after them properly, not be cared for badly, as I'm afraid is the experience for some.
Is it possible to come back on that particular example?
Very shortly.
It seems to me the example of patients you give who are in pretty good nick, who are asking for assisted dying, are very unusual in my experience. But even if they are, many of them ask for assisted dying well in advance of reaching the terminal phase, because then they bank the permission. And that's true of the Oregon experience. 9,500 people in one particular year discussed assisted dying with their physician. 49 avail themselves of it. So in many cases, people, as it were, have an insurance of having discussed this, knowing that it's an option. Doesn't mean to say they're immediately going to cash the prescription. And if they're doing cartwheels or whatever. And so
in Oregon,
on,
we don't know what happens to the drugs that aren't taken either. There's absolutely no tracking system. We don't know whether they're given to other relatives, whether they're sold on, what happens. They don't have a prescription tracking system. So you have to recognise that even in that situation, you just can't monitor it.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to invite you to vote again on the question. I was handed a note that said, please ask everyone to only vote once. I didn't know we were in Northern Ireland, so I'm somewhat puzzled by that instruction. Can I ask that you now vote in accordance with the same system as before, red for yes and blue for no. Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it will take a few minutes for the votes to be counted, and in that time, and in view of the fact that the vote has been taken, I would invite members of the audience who would wish to do so to pose short questions to both panels. Thank you. There's a lady at the back of the room who responded with alacrity.
Thank you. Am I making a noise? Yeah? Is it? Okay. My question is to John's team. Why did you decide to concentrate on showing that it could never be demonstrated that it wouldn't be open to abuse, rather than it not being wise to support it in principle?
You begin.
Well, first of all, we had to live with the question we were given, and there's already been some discussion about that. I think a more general discussion about that. So that was the question, and so we responded to the question I was given. But in fact, I did try to deal with the ethical question, if I've got you right as to what you... I mean, I wasn't just dealing with the question of practicalities as to whether or not assurances... Sorry, I'm forgetting what actually the exact... Yeah, I think it was, could it in principle be demonstrated that assisted dying suicide would never be open to abuse And in any case, though sometimes, I'm sorry, I've forgotten exactly what the form of it was. Yeah. But yes, if we could have the question, that'd be useful, yeah. I don't myself think that it's a particularly, well, I think we've got it here now, yeah, a particularly helpful question. But nonetheless, if it could be demonstrated that it would never be open to abuse, would you support in principle the idea of assisted dying? That was the question we were given. I'm making 2 points. One is it couldn't be demonstrated that it would never be open to abuse. But secondly, even if it could be shown that it was, of course we'd have to say what abuse in this context meant, that I was opposed to it on grounds, on sort of intrinsic ethical grounds. So I did try to deal with both of those. But I think that Baroness Finley had more to say, I think, about the questions of abuse, so she might want to respond on that.
Why did I answer it? Well, when I was at school, I was taught read the question and answer the question in front of you. So being very obedient, I tried to look at the question. I mean, it struck me, it's a bit like saying, if you could prove that there'd never be any theft, would there ever be a place for locking your houses? I mean, I just don't understand how you can have such a theoretical question and do anything other than vote yes in response to it, really.
I thought that some of the points that you had said actually persuaded me to turn to blue in principle rather than
which was blue.
Because
blue was no. Well, I'm absolutely delighted, but I was just worried about the question, so that's why I approached it.
Interesting to say about answering the question, because I would suggest to my higher class, some of whom are here, that if the question says if it could be demonstrated, they should answer that. If it could be demonstrated that it would never be open to abuse, rather than saying, yeah, but it couldn't.
Okay. Well, I'm really glad you're teaching your class to read the question, because when they do their hires, that will be the key determinant for them.
But do notice that both parts were considered.
Would it be possible to contribute to this on that question? Of course, Baroness Finley's whole career has been devoted to not turning people blue, so it's surprising that...
Sorry. I do go in the intensive care unit and sometimes take people off ventilators. Excuse me. I'm not a vitalist. Okay, I'm not a pro-life vitalist. Let's be quite clear about that. Okay. Withdrawing consent for treatment is absolutely appropriate. Stopping futile treatment is completely appropriate.
Now may I just comment on that? Because I think that's a tremendously important point. That I have to say that I find it very hard to understand how accepting the appropriateness of withdrawing treatment or acceding to a request to have no resuscitation or not to receive treatment, how tremendously different that is from acceding to a request to give some treatment that would help to ease somebody's passing if they're about to die.
You're talking about killing them, you're not talking about easing their passing. You're giving them a drug to end their life within hopefully a few minutes.
Hang on a second. I'm going to say, if you switch off a ventilator, you're removing air, which is not a medication.
Actually, the people who are ventilated are being kept alive artificially with a condition that would have otherwise killed them, and your duty remains to relieve their distress and symptoms while they're dying. The interesting thing is that you switch off the ventilator and some patients start breathing again spontaneously and actually eventually get up and walk around and do get better even when they were thought to be dying.
Can I say that, I mean, in these circumstances, what you've introduced is an inhibiting cause, right? What you've introduced is something that is blocking a flow that would otherwise be taking place. And so in those circumstances, by removing that inhibiting cause, the primary agent takes effect, the disease, whatever else it may be. And certainly if you had to say what was the cause of death, it's not going to be written down switching off the ventilator. No. It's going to be whatever.
Now, this is an interesting bit of casuistry, because it is really exposed by this very good example. Because you can, say, have the principle of the double effect, which Laura questions, but you can increase the morphine in order to relieve the suffering, as a result of which people may get respiratory depression, as a result of which they die. But your primary intention was to relieve suffering, and only by accident did they die. When you're switching off a ventilator, and in most cases you have a 100% chance that they will die, then suddenly your primary and secondary intentions pretty well overlap. That is, the intention to alleviate suffering and the intention to kill actually are pretty well overlapping. And that's, I think, a very difficult example for you, and it illustrates...
Can you just remember the principle of justice, though?
I'm quite delighted that by having the vote, we've removed the inhibiting cause of debate.
Sorry. You've got a principle of justice.
And I think we should continue for a few moments longer. Baroness Finley,
yeah, sorry. You've got a principle of justice. You have a limited number of intensive care beds. You cannot keep everybody in intensive care if continuing them there is not achieving a therapeutic goal, because I'm afraid blue lighters are arriving at A&E. That's the real world that we live in. And therefore, you do have to take decisions. You put someone on a ventilator expecting to achieve a therapeutic aim. You don't put them on if you don't anticipate that you will achieve that. If the course of time demonstrates that you were wrong and you're not going to achieve a therapeutic goal at all, then I'm not advocating, or I don't know whether you are, that you go down the American route of having people lying around in ITU for years, being ventilated with no chance of any improvement. We do have rationing in the UK. That's the principle of justice, the principle of the right of the patient to the best treatment within the resources available, but also the just allocation of resources.
Professor Grayling, do you want to come back for a moment? I'm not sure we'll have time for further questions.
Well, perhaps we ought to have questions. We should shut up.
But I do think it's a very important point. The reason why in America people do lie in intensive care units for year after year after year is because of the tremendous anxiety that people have about switching off ventilators and the possibility of being sued and the rest. They've gone to an extreme with that anxiety, which moves them quite in the opposite direction from the one where, in the practicalities and realities of the situation that we face, looking after people at the very end of life, we try to finesse this question of whether, when we've decided to do something, that is switch off a ventilator, knowing what the consequence might be, that we want to treat that as if it were different from saying to somebody who is in a terrible state, yes, I will give you that prescription. And again, I repeat, I know John's going to, but it is a case of casuistry, that distinction.
Well, no, what I was going to say was just about the circumstance in the United States, which is, I think it's not unconnected with the strength of the contractual rights culture that is there. I mean, which is partly market-driven. As you say, it's precisely a terror of litigation. It is that people are pitched against one another because moral discourse has been transformed into a discourse of competing rights. I don't know whether or not we can continue this discussion. If we're going to do so, I think it ought to be responsive to the question.
Right. Can I say this? There should be no terror of litigation.
I thought you were a lawyer. How do you make your money?
What I'm going to do is announce the result of the two votes, if I may. The first vote, and I repeat the question, if it could be demonstrated that it would never be open to abuse, would you support in principle the idea of assisted dying? And those voting yes in response to that question numbered 77 on the first vote, and those voting no numbered 3 on the first vote. On the second vote, those voting yes numbered 68, and those voting no 11. So I would say that both panels have experienced a victory. And I would invite you to thank them for their contributions this evening.
I think it's rather like that Radio 4 program today, when you really get a good discussion going. Somebody says, well, we could go on like this all day long, but we can't because the clock's ticking over, and so it comes to an end. I mean, the discussion really got going, but the clock also kept up, and we're due to finish at exactly 8 o'clock. So if I may, on behalf of all of us, on behalf of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, thank you for presiding, chairing, and thank the Faculty of Advocates, too, for being involved with this, and thanking both sides of the argument. I thought both cases were put extremely well. Probably the only thing that wasn't put terribly well was the question. Thank you all very much, and thank you for coming.